This week, Karl Marx, the so-called father of communism, turns 200. Some achievement if he were alive instead of just his ideas, which still stir socialist societies around the world. Is socialism regaining favour as the gap between the haves and the have-nots grows? You're watching Round Table. I'm David Foster. The Communist Manifesto, co-authored by Marx, still sells and sells. What would he have made of today's world? Going where he wanted, or up the communist creek?
He was born 200 years ago. Karl Marx, the father of communism. The socialist giant has a mixed reputation, but mainstream politics is embracing his ideas once more. Could we be entering a new era of modern-day socialism? After Russia's brutal civil war, the ideology of Marxism-Leninism became the dogma of the Soviet Union. It had acolytes such as Chairman Mao and Fidel Castro. Today, China, North Korea and Cuba are considered among the last remaining communist societies. In theory, communism is a classless, harmonious, democratic system. But in practice, such societies have been characterized by fear and state repression. While most of the world has rejected communism, many societies have flirted with aspects of socialism. After economic liberalism swept through Latin America in the 80s and 90s, leaving inequality and debt in its wake, the people turned towards new, left-leaning leadership. By the 21st century, the so-called pink tide had swept through most of South America. But it's looking like that tide may have turned. A recent collapse in the value of oil has plunged Venezuela's economy into crisis, and critics say its socialist values have failed to save it. Inflation jumped to 2,400% in 2017, and in the last 2 years, the country's currency has lost 99.9% of its dollar value. Venezuelans are abandoning the country in droves. But elsewhere in the world, socialism is regaining its appeal. Socialist values are particularly popular among the under-30s, a generation whose economic experience has been dominated by crisis, economic stagnation, and rising inequality. Socialists like Jeremy Corbyn in the United Kingdom and Bernie Sanders in the United States have seen the ranks of their supporters swell. Nordic countries have found a way to combine free market capitalism with a welfare state. Higher taxes pay for benefits like education and universal healthcare, and generous pensions in later life.
Yes, always happy.
Yes, we are.
In the 170 years since Marx wrote his manifesto, his thoughts and theories have been reinvented time and again by leaders around the world. For some, socialism is emerging as a new hope. For others, it will never shake its legacy of repression, poverty, and authoritarian rule. But at a time of growing global inequality and political uncertainty, could Marx's legacy become part of a new vision for the future?
Good to have your company. Also good to welcome to the round table Roger Bootle, Chairman of Capital Economics, also one of the so-called wise men who advised the British government on economic policy. We have Eunice Goyce, Associate Professor of Politics at Richmond University in London. John Rees, political activist and author of The ABC of Socialism, and Ben Harris-Quinney, Chairman of the Bow Group, a conservative think tank. Thank you all very much indeed. I'm going to cast you back more than a century and a half. And imagine you were Karl Marx, mid-19th century. What were you thinking when you put down on paper what you did with the Communist Manifesto?
Well, I would have just lived through a revolutionary experience myself in 1848 throughout Europe and in his native Germany, and I would be watching the way in which the Industrial Revolution was taking hold of modern society, a way in which huge corporations were beginning to emerge, huge industrial conurbations. I'd be watching a huge gap open up between the rich and the poor, and I would have seen the beginning of working class resistance to the way in which those people were treated in the huge factories and the slums in which they lived. And I would be, with my co-writer, Frederick Engels, sitting down to catalogue that experience and to explain why it was that you were watching a society.
Of course, one of the strange things is that Engels came from a very rich family, mill owners in the north of England.
And he hated it. He absolutely
Well, he inherited
detested it.
$4.5 million. By that
Yeah,
standard,
and
it's an awful lot of money.
Yeah, and he used it to keep Karl Marx writing.
Okay. So do you think he was a misty-eyed visionary? Do you think he was somebody who just put down ideas, or were they practical in any way?
I think he tried to match his theories and his vision to reality. That's why he spent so many hours in the British Library researching the archives, trying to find the data about the working conditions in all the factories in England and so on. All sorts of data to see if it matched his own ideas, and in particular how he would think that capitalism would eventually collapse, the way that he analyzed, the way that the economy worked, in particular the productive
And we'll
forces.
get on to whether he was right or wrong a little bit later.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
but I think that he tried to bring, that was his aim, like so many scholars, to try to match the reality to a theory, to try to see if his theories could be demonstrated
Clever
by the
guy.
reality. He was he was very, very clever. I think we owe him a lot in terms of understanding of capitalism. Many monetarist economists praise Marx and take on Marxist economic analysis, and I think without him, our own understanding of capitalism would be flawed.
I think Ben's dying to jump in, but I'm going to ask you to hold it for just a second, because we were talking about economics there, and you described him as an economist of a sort. What do you mean?
Well, he's part of a tradition building on the works of Ricardo. He's one of the great classical economists. I don't think one can deny that. On this question, is he bright or not? Well, undoubtedly he's bright in an academic sense. But the person I contrast him with is Keynes. See, I've got no time, dare I say it, for these purely academic economists to spend their time in the British Museum or wherever they do. They're writing about the world, and if they've got no experience of the world, frankly, I'm not interested in what they've got to say. Now, Keynes is a man who was equally, far more brilliant, I think, than Marx academically, but he spent his life in the world, and therefore I think what he had to say deserved some listening to.
Ben, you did want to jump in. You were frowning.
Well, yes. I mean, I think there's a slight misassessment about what Marx analysed. It was not the first time that Marx put pen to paper that there had been a great disparity between the have and the have-nots. That, in fact, formed most of human history before that. What I think Marx was most importantly acknowledging, that the balance was shifting in terms of population increase, aided by the Industrial Revolution. And there was a real problem of disenfranchisement in terms of that of actors in a democratic sense, but also in an economic sense. And so I think much of the problems, many of the problems that Marx identified were correct. The problem is that the solutions that he proposed were led to some of the most destructive results in human history.
Well, I should just ask this question. Are we, in fact, we know we're more globalized, but are we more polarized, perhaps, as he suggested in the manifesto?
We had a period in the 20th century where that polarization was somehow, I wouldn't say suppressed, but very much mitigated. And that mitigation came from the regulation of capitalism, the welfare state that was created, and a series of other measures that other parties, mainstream center-right and center-left parties, adopted in reaction to a certain extent to what they can perceive to be the threat of communism, but also already from at the turn of the 19th century, it was the understanding of the incredible power that the working class, an enfranchised working class, can have in terms of representative politics. Disraeli in Britain understood that very well when he defended the universal male suffrage in Britain. And they tried, the one nation conservatism tradition comes from that understanding that in order to remain a relevant political force in a democracy, you need to cater for the interests and the concerns of the working class. So therefore, you take into account and you legalize trade unions, you respond to their demands in terms of the improvement of the working conditions of the working class, you start to create unemployment benefits, you try to create a welfare system that protects workers from the ravages of capitalism.
Roger, from an economic point of view, was it ever workable, the communist system?
I don't think so, no. There have been various attempts at it. Well, these labels can be misleading, can't they? I mean, you've got a government in China that calls itself communist, and it's extremely successful. And there are elements of that model that I think have worked really very, very well. That's to say, I'm not a free market fundamentalist by any manner or means. And they've done a much better job, I think, the communist authorities in China, of managing the transition to a more modern, more market-related economy than their equivalents in Russia. But I can't think of, and it's not really communist in any meaningful sense anymore, frankly, this is the point. It's a form of state capitalism.
But let me take you back to the question, which was it ever going to work in the form that Marx suggested economically?
No, I don't think it was, and I don't think his economics makes a lot of sense. Well, for a start, I think he's very naive about social divisions. He's very mechanistic in the way he thinks. I mean, okay, there are extremes of income and status in society now, of course there are, but they're not quite the ones that he saw or foresaw. And this notion of interesting, now we've got robotics and IT coming along, of a world of great abundance, of terrific productive power, which capitalism would bring along. Because a lot of people think that mistakenly...
Which was Marx's point.
Exactly. A lot of people mistakenly think he was against capitalism. Well, he wasn't quite, was he? He saw it as a stage in historical development. Society's got to go through that.
But this is the interesting, when you say the communist system as he envisaged it, well, let's just stand back a bit and think what that was. Because, of course, the natural image is the one that Ben's referred to of
and we must go into that.
Yeah, and it's it is important.
In a minute.
And, but I think Roger was absolutely right to describe that as state capitalism. Engels was damning about this. He said, if you think that just that state ownership is socialism, well then, he said, the regimental tailors and the royal porcelain manufacturer would be socialist organisations, and they're not. What was important to Marx, and what he saw in the Paris Commune, was democracy, was democratic control over economic matters. And his big critique of parliamentary socialism was that it only had democracy for politics. It didn't have democracy over whether you've got a job, what you're paid for it, what you produce at the end of the day. And he thought that a socialist system would be democracy extended into the economic realm.
John's right that I've never actually seen third-level communism.
Explain what you mean by that, because I saw it in your notes and I was going to ask you anyway.
There are, as Marx and Engels theorised, there are 3 stages to communism. It begins with the state taking control of all national assets. It then transitions to the state redistributing wealth, and then ultimately communes developing that are self-sustaining. It never reaches third stage communism, I would argue, because, as Roger said, it lacks a realistic understanding of human nature. And what we've seen in every single country where communism has been adopted is the state gains power and does not want to relinquish that power, and so then becomes tyrannical.
But the question being missed here is, who controls the state? Marx was a Democrat. He started out fighting in a democratic revolution. To the end of his life, he believed that democratic control over the state was even the first stage of
where does it go wrong?
Assets, you need that.
Does it go wrong because people are power hungry, they don't want to relinquish power? Does it go wrong because it's economically unsound? Does it go wrong for any other reasons? Why has communism, as laid out perhaps by Marx, turned into something totally different?
Because, first of all, he was extremely vague about what he meant by a communist society. He was far more detailed in his analysis of capitalism than in his prescriptions, because he also felt that a communist society or an ideal society would be the result of the social forces and values of its time. So, as a man of a particular time, he was not really in position to dictate what would be the conditions of a communist society. And then we have the reality that communism happened exactly in the place where Marx never believed that it would happen, because he felt that communism was a result of advanced capitalist societies. And where does it take place? Russia, mostly a rural society. So where there was not a proletariat, or very small proletariat, and where the largest section of the population was rural, which for Marx, this was the most backwards, reactionary class in society. So it started already, the problem with communism has to do with it had to be adapted to completely different circumstances from those envisioned by Marx.
So why did it lead to the purges? Why did it lead to the gulags? Was it economics? Was it because people didn't have the money, because they didn't know how to run an economy?
I think it's economics. It's fundamentally about politics and control and the power of the state, the points that have already been discussed. Fired by, and this is, I think, where Marx does come in, fired by ideology. I think it's very difficult to get people to behave in normal societies anyway, in the way that they did in communist Russia without a system of belief. And boy, there really was a system of belief, stretching back to Marx. He really powered people, I think, with a sense of belief that they were doing the right thing, the way of the future. And this lasted actually until well after the Second World War, when, of course, for a time it looked as though the Soviet Union was doing extremely well.
But what was happening in the Soviet Union then was also you had the diversions of interpretations of what Marx meant, from Lenin to then Trotsky and then Stalin. So there you had, so there was Marxism, that was the base, but then there were all the interpretations and how it was applied. And I think from there, you had the purges and you had the state control as well.
Yeah, sorry.
This is absolutely right, of course, and not only in Russia, but everywhere people were arguing about different sorts of Marxism. And I think the really important characteristic, of course, most of these people would never have read the great book Capital, never even picked it up or seen it, but nevertheless they might have been Marxists of various
But also, I mean, the other thing is that all huge transformations in human history, the transformation from despotic monarchies to parliamentary democracies, takes place through a series of revolutionary processes, many of which fail. So, I mean, in this country, we had the first modern democratic revolution in the 17th century. We didn't get parliamentary democracy until 1928. So there were long periods where the initial impetus to transform society gets frustrated, thrown back. There are counter-revolutions as well as revolutions. And that process is still in play.
Was what Marx put down either in the Communist Manifesto or in the many other writings that he put out there, Das Kapital, as suggested, was he in any way to blame for what followed in the name of communism?
Well, I think that he was. I'm not suggesting that he perhaps saw all of the unintended consequences that his work would result in. But I think it comes from that lack of knowledge of the real world. And almost all of Marx's prescriptions were theoretical. They weren't evidence-based. As I say, I think he identified a lot of problems with society that were accurate.
You started this by saying, yes, he perhaps was. In what way was he perhaps responsible?
Because I think if you write and speak with such fervour about something on which you don't really know the results of, and even within Marx's lifetime, he was aware of the political power that he wielded, and with that comes huge responsibility. And I think he at least had a glimpse of the amount of people that he was going to influence. And on some level, he must have known that his theory was not grounded in fact or in evidence, and could have led to the results that it did.
This is hard to believe. I mean, essentially, the amount of power that Marx wielded during his lifetime was negligible. I mean, the number of people at Marx's funeral didn't get above 20. So
I think it was about 9 or 10,
yeah,
wasn't it?
So there's that.
He wouldn't have done what he did if he didn't think that there was some chance of his works being hugely influential in the century. In fact, he saw it as inevitable.
Not everybody who claims the mantle of Marx is justified in doing it. Indeed, during Marx's lifetime, there were a group of people in France who called themselves Marxists that were so far away from his own ideas that he said to Paul Lafarge, all I know is that I'm not a Marxist. And that we have to deal with greater sensitivity and more complexity about the way in which those ideas get used in different social contexts. I mean, Eunice already said, the last place Marx expected this to happen was in a poverty-stricken society where the vast majority of people were peasants. And none of the people who made that revolution thought it could succeed unless it spread to more industrialised countries. There's a lot more technical.
I'm going to get on to sort of where we are today in just a moment, but Roger, you were sort of nodding in agreement. What point did you want to make?
Well, it's just going back to the point about, people call themselves Marxists and they might not even have read any Marx, actually. You have to be, I think, to this extent, forgiving of the man himself. I think of this really as a sort of religion. And just as with all great religions, there are various sects, and a lot of them haven't gone back and read the original texts, and they've got these strong beliefs. Beyond Marx, the person who really transformed this and launched communism on the path that followed was surely Lenin. Now, he wore the badge of Marx, and Marx was quoted a lot by him and by others, but he did things in Marx's name that maybe Marx wouldn't have done.
Can I just read something from Yanis Varoufakis? I mean, very, very to the left, if we want to put labels on people, Greek finance minister over the last 10 years. And he said it would take the collapse of the Soviet Union and insertion of 2 billion Chinese and Indian workers into the capitalist labour market for its prediction to be vindicated, the manifesto. For capital, I beg your pardon, to globalise fully, the regimes that pledged allegiance to that manifesto had first to be torn asunder. Has history ever produced a more delicious irony?
Well, I think what Varoufakis is pointing to is actually a very important element of the long-term influence of Marx. Because, of course, when Marx wrote about the working class being the heart of a capitalist society, being an agent of change, that system was limited to the northwestern part of Europe and to parts of North America. Now it truly is a global system. I mean,
I suppose what he's saying, he's saying the system as envisaged by Marx has fallen apart, and therefore we're left with total globalisation. What I'm going to ask you now is, are we ever going to see anything approaching his ideas in the 21st, next century or whatever? Or is it, we're seeing movements, but...
Well, I think
many
modern movements start out in exactly the place where Marx started out in 1848. If you think about the Arab revolutions, which probably in our lifetime are the most extensive and widespread group of revolutionary upheavals, they started out over questions of democracy. They involved trade unionists, critically in the one successful one to date in Tunisia. And I think Marx would have seen that coming a few years after a great economic crisis, linked to a hike in bread prices, but raising questions of democracy. Marx would have seen that and thought, wow, things that I only saw in Europe are now in the whole of the Arab world.
But it has no power without violence, as we saw perhaps. And
no power without violence.
Yeah, in terms of getting communist regimes into power.
It has been attempted in very few places. So in all the places we've seen, there's been repression. But there are other
violent revolution. And that's unlikely these days, perhaps?
Violent revolutions. Well, there's been cases of practically non-violent revolutions. I can talk about my own country, where there was a practically bloodless revolution. The people who were shot were shot by the old outgoing regime. But we can also talk about, more and foresee transitions. Revolutions is actually quite hard to predict at this stage. We are in a moment of great uncertainty. There is great turmoil. There is a lot of unpopular insatisfaction. Revolutions, there's been a huge investment in weakening the power of those social groups that would essentially...
The suggestion, perhaps, Ben, is that the seeds are still there for the kind of revolution that Marx envisaged.
Well, I
particularly
think,
now, given dissatisfaction.
It's a misreading of Marx to suggest that he only saw a revolution in Northern Europe, because fundamental to his project was that it's a global uniting of the workers and a global revolution. I think part of the reason the Soviet Union failed was it was constrained in its ability to expand, and this was the whole basis of American containment policy, that if you can contain it, you will eventually defeat it. Now, many of those same problems that Marx identified, I think, are relevant, because I think his analysis of some of the fundamental problems of society were correct. So capitalism only works if actors are enfranchised with capital, And what we have in the neoliberal globalist system is people in general with far, far higher living standards than they had in Marx's time or in time prior to that. So I don't think in countries like Britain there's the same struggle of poverty that was as apparent and real in his time. But I think there is a similar imbalance of power that has developed.
Well, perhaps the 1%, you know, the world's wealthiest have now become, in some cases, the 0.1%, because the disparity between the very richest and the very poorest in modern societies, as opposed to in necessarily developing
but I think
is still very great.
The point to make that because he was right in assessing the problems, which many philosophers and economists have assessed, does not mean he was right in the solutions. And that's been the great problem and danger of Marx, that people have assumed that because he spotted problems with the capitalist system, that his solutions must be the solution to those problems. And of course, what we've seen throughout history since is that it's demonstrated not to be the case.
We've been arguing about it for the last 150 years. I'm afraid we're going to have to postpone the next instalment of this discussion because we've reached the end of our time. I know you wanted to say something, you wanted to jump in there, Eunice, but worth ending with something that was, I think, was at the end of the first chapter of the Communist Manifesto. What the bourgeoisie therefore produces, above all, are its own gravediggers. Its fall and the victory of the proletariat are equally inevitable. You've been watching Roundtable. That hasn't happened yet, but you never know. I'm David Foster from me and the team. Thank you for watching. Thank you to all of my guests. Hope to have your company next time. Bye-bye.